Today we're going to discuss the politics of the Gilded Age, and this will be a multi-part video, but at the first video we're going to look at the transformation, if you will, from the politics of the Reconstruction era. We have Ulysses S. Grant in office at the beginning of this class, but historians, in starting this at 1876, picked it for a reason. They start 1302 in 1876 because that is an election year. And in that election of 1876, two very sound candidates squared off against each other, which is a rarity in American history, that two extremely good and intellectual candidates vied for the highest office. And you see on the left the Republican Rutherford Burchard Hayes, hailing from the all-important state of Ohio. Ohio was important then, it's important now as a key state. Any president that wins the office most likely has to carry Ohio. And so in this day and time, you're going to see a lot of presidents and presidential candidates from Ohio. And then Samuel Jones Tilden. Tilden was from New York, and they both were known as reformers with varying degrees of reform platforms. And then you see on the inset, you see their vice presidential candidates as they run for the office. In the 1876 election, as historian H.W. Brands has said, the electorate was so divided, and this is the first election that re-enfranchised Southerners are going to participate. And with the renewed energy, the renewed voting base of the Democratic Party, the Republicans are going to find it hard to hold on to the office. Republicans have been in the White House since 1861 with the election of Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln served a term and a peace with Andrew Johnson as vice president, fulfilling his second term after Lincoln's death. And then you have the election of Ulysses S. Grant for 2 terms. So you have 16 years that the Republicans have controlled the White House. And Democrats are hungry for a return. And so they energize their base with a return to the spoils of the office. But the Republicans, in answering that, fall upon a tactic that they had used quite well in previous elections and will use in future elections, called waving the bloody shirt. They remind voters through music, through slogans, through campaign speeches, that it was the Democrats that were the party of secession. It was the Democrats that were the party of the South. It's the Democrats that were the party that killed your brother and your father and your second cousin twice removed. It's the Democrats that drove a wedge in the nation. And quite literally what would happen as they went out on the stump, they would pull out of their backpack or out of their satchel, they would pull a shirt blood-stained and torn from bullet holes, and they would hold it up and remind voters, this is what Democrats did to the nation. On the other hand, Democratic candidates would remind the nation that you've had 16 years of Republican control, and the Grant administration was one of the most corrupt that has ever existed in American history, but especially to that point in time. And they would remind voters that it's time to clean house. They need a change of hands, if you will, to out with the old and in with the new. And so waving the bloody shirt versus clean house became the campaign slogans. And on election day, as the two candidates squared off at the polls, it was so close that with the swing of any 10 states, the election could change. 10 states were so close that just a few thousand voters would make the difference. And as the votes were counted, the popular vote went for Tilden. So too did the electoral vote. And it appeared that a Democrat would enter the White House for the first time in those many years. But don't print the inaugural program yet. Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican Party, challenged that the Democrats had cheated. They said in a number of states there were fraudulent returns submitted. that voters had been suppressed at the polls, that Democrat operatives throughout the South especially had driven away the black vote, had maybe inflated the white vote with cemeteries voting and pets voting, and that there had been cheating all across the South. On their side, the Democrats said, no, we didn't cheat, you cheated, that you inflated the black vote, tried to suppress the white vote across the South. And so there grew a contention with the Republicans charging that in 4 states, Florida, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Oregon, that there was voting irregularities. What do? This is a constitutional crisis that could shake the foundations of the republic. And so the decision was made to hold an electoral commission and review the ballots for those 4 states. And in determining that, they chose the breakdown that you see on the board of senators, representatives, and Supreme Court justices. So you had 2 Democratic senators, 3 Republican senators, 3 Democratic representatives, 2 Republican representatives, 2 Democratic Supreme Court justices, and 2 Republican Supreme Court justices. But you say, wait a minute, you have on the board, you have 3. Well, you see, there was initially appointed 1 independent. Justice David Davis was an independent Supreme Court justice, and he was chosen to fill the spot of the 15th member to make this an unbiased and balanced commission. Once the Electoral Commission was announced, however, the state of Illinois, their governor's office being vacant, they appointed David Davis as governor of Illinois. Now, the Illinois legislature was controlled by Republicans, and this was, of course, an attempt to sway Davis and his vote on the commission. Davis accepted the appointment, but the Republicans had intended that Davis would stay in office through the sitting of the Electoral Commission. But they didn't count on one thing, and that was David Davis being, and I know this is an oxymoron, an honest politician. David Davis, upon being selected as governor of Illinois, resigned from the Supreme Court and thus was not eligible to be on the Electoral Commission. So when the Electoral Commission had to sit, David Davis was replaced by a Republican Supreme Court justice. The only ones available were Republicans, Joseph Bradley. And so the ultimate Electoral Commission was 2 Democratic Supreme Court justices and 3 Republican Supreme Court justices. So if you do the math, you should never trust a historian on math. So if you want to do the math yourself, that comes out to 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats. Commission of 15, with the Republicans having an edge. They brought the first, and you see the painting there of the Electoral Commission sitting. This is the first major constitutional crisis of the Republic that we'll have later. This brings to mind the election of 2000 and the hanging chads, and the nightly news focused on electoral observers counting each vote by hand. Well, this is senators and representatives and Supreme Court justices getting together and examining the evidence put before them and reaching a decision. And so the first that's brought to them is Oregon. And they look at the electoral returns of Oregon and they say, well, this is clearly a procedural issue. Oregon, one of the electors had voted different from the rest of the electors, and it was more of a question of whether Oregon, that one vote could vote separate from the others, and it turns out, yes, you can. Other states had done it. So in the Electoral Commission, that was fairly easy to decide. It wasn't a matter of voting fraud. It was a matter of procedure. And so the commission voted 8-7 in favor of Rutherford B. Hayes receiving that electoral vote. Then they bring the issue of Louisiana. They present the evidence of corruption, of fraud, etc. They examine all the evidence, make a very public spectacle of it, and then the 15 get together, and I'm sure stroking their beards, reach a decision. Oh, yeah, yes, that's what we need to. And they vote 8-7 in favor of Hayes. Florida brought before them. Imagine voting problems in Florida. They bring the vote before the Electoral Commission. They examine it, give it the due process, and vote 8-7 for Hayes. They bring South Carolina before the Electoral Commission. They examine it, once again, 8-7 for Hayes. You take the electoral votes of South Carolina, Florida, Louisiana, and Oregon away from Tilden and give them to Hayes. Hayes wins the Electoral College. And winning the electoral vote makes Rutherford B. Hayes president. Democrats threatened to block the Hayes presidency until hell froze over. They felt that they were robbed, and they were ready to not necessarily go to war, but do everything within legal means to oppose a Hayes presidency. And so Republicans and Democrats meet together and decide on the Compromise of 1876. This Compromise of 1876 had 5 parts. First, the Democrats would accept and recognize and not contest the presidency of Rutherford B. Hayes. It was a bitter pill for Tilden to swallow. And I ask yourself, what would you do? What would you do if you had been elected president by the popular vote and the electoral vote and then had it taken away from you? What would have been your recourse? Would it have been the recourse of Al Gore in 2000 and lawyer up? Or would it have been the recourse of Richard Nixon in 1960 when he accused Kennedy of electoral fraud and decided, rather than challenge it, to accept it, to not drag the nation through a bitter dispute? Tilden went the route of Nixon. He chose the good of his party over the good of self. And so he accepted Rutherford B. Hayes as president and asked for his party to do the same. In return, of course, the South and the Democrats got some goodies. The new president, in this case Hayes, number 2, would remove all remaining federal troops that remained in the South and thus effectively end Reconstruction. And so with the ascension of Hayes to the presidency in 1877, one of the first things that he does as president is to order the troops to officially return control of the states. Now, it's not like Tennessee and Florida or whatever have become independent again. They're just not controlled, and they don't have federal oversight that they've had for the previous 9 years. And so control is returned to the states, and Reconstruction in the South is officially ended. And that's key to understanding what's to come with Jim Crow and the segregation of the South. It wasn't that the South had a new mindset. If anything, Reconstruction hardened the positions of the diehards in the South. It formalized the Bourbon Redeemers' position that we've talked about in other places. It formalized their position as leaders within the community. It didn't improve the position of the black man. In fact, quite the opposite. He became a political pawn. And I say him because only black males could vote. But they became political pawns in the process. Reconstruction didn't end because the South had been rebuilt. In fact, that's a misnomer. Reconstruction had very little to do with rebuilding the South. It was a government program of re-education and repoliticalization. And so the Compromise of 1876 brings Reconstruction to an end with all of the issues that continue to trouble us today out there in embryo form to grow into major issues. Third, Hayes would agree to appoint a Democrat to his administration. We continue this practice today. If a Republican is in office, generally the social service types offices, Health and Human Resources, or whatever they're calling it this month, those offices have changed names a number of times over the years. But Republicans don't tend to flock to those offices, so they'll call in a Democrat, and the Republican president will appoint a Democrat to be a part of his cabinet. Democrats tend to not really want much to do with defense and military. And so Republicans are usually appointed in Democratic administrations to oversee the Department of Defense. And so in this day and time, this is where it begins. The Hayes administration was required to appoint at least one Democrat, Southern Democrat, to his administration. And so he chose David Key of Tennessee to serve as Postmaster General. A fourth thing, and we've talked about this in a previous lecture on the creation of the railroads, but number 4, one of the things that the South insisted is that a second transcontinental railroad be funded by federal funds. So the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific have already created that first transcontinental railroad, but now the South demands a railroad to serve the South. And so originating in New Orleans, traveling through Texas, across the South, tying into the Texas Pacific Railway, ultimately the Southern Pacific will be chartered and will service the South. And then 5th, the South demanded legislation that would encourage businesses and factories to not only do business in the South, but to move and to take up residency in the South. So an attempt to diversify the Southern economy, if you will. So Hayes enters office under a cloud of controversy, not scandal. Hayes isn't a corrupt man. All of these political events are swirling around him, and what tends to get lost is he was a very decent man. He was an honest, if you want to use that term again, an honest politician that was caught up in the events of the day. And it was the party more than the individual that emphasized and transformed his presidency. The Democrats may have had to accept Hayes as president, but they didn't have to like it. And so they would refer to President Hayes not as His Excellency the President, they would call him His Fraudulency. They would refer to him as Old 8 and 7. And so poor President Hayes had to endure the slings and arrows of men and women that would normally have respected him because of his integrity. He had to accept their attacks because of the manner in which he was elected. And that's going to be a problem. His presidency is under a cloud throughout his time in office because of the manner of his election. Once again, that's a shame because after 8 years of Ulysses S. Grant was a hard drinker, a hard smoker, a hard cusser. The White House had become almost a saloon. And so Lucy Hayes, the wife of Rutherford B. Hayes, comes into the White House and cleans it out, both literally and figuratively. Throwing open the windows, she welcomes new groups into the White House. She eliminates the cigar smoke. While Rutherford B. Hayes did smoke cigars, he smoked them outside because his wife told him to. She threw out all of the alcohol and served lemonade at state functions. And so she earned the epitaph, Lemonade Lucy. And so the Hayes administration quite literally was a cleaning of the house. And it brought integrity and honor back to the White House after the 8 years of Grant. Unfortunately, that doesn't help the Hayes presidency. As you see in the upper left, Hayes' presidency is going to be beset by a number of things, and I've kind of numbered these. Number 1, his manner of election, but number 2, and you see that in the upper left, the Hayes presidency is going to endure a number of very large riots, labor riots that take to the streets of major cities, Pittsburgh, Baltimore, Philadelphia. And he's going to be in a position as commander-in-chief of calling out the troops and putting down those uprisings, those riots, and any president who does so is always going to be frowned upon. Beneath the picture of the riots, you see a representation of the trains and the great labor strikes of the 1877 and 78. The great railroad strike of 76 that leads into 77. And Hayes has to threaten to use federal troops to keep the railroads open, which seems that he, as a reformer, is betraying labor, but at the same time, federalizing the railroads would be a slap at capital, and so he angers both sides. A third issue, and you see that in the middle cartoon and the two cartoons on the right. California especially had been filling up with Chinese immigrants to build the Central Pacific Railway. And California residents wanted to eliminate Chinese immigration, and in some instances they called for a removal of the Chinese that were already in the United States. They introduced a bill into Congress called the Chinese Exclusion Act. And in the Chinese Exclusion Act, it would severely curtail, if not eliminate, Chinese immigration. It also set up a number of discriminatory practices against Chinese already in America, and it was known that Hayes disagreed with it. And so you see in the Illustrated Wasp, the San Francisco newspaper, the Illustrated Wasp, labor punching the Chinaman in the mouth. They're very much for these exclusions, but then in the other Illustrated Wasp, this is a warning to the Hayes administration. If you veto this legislation, and he's got the pistol of the veto up to his own head, you're going to commit political suicide. And he's got the specter, the ghost of revolution hanging over him. That if he vetoes this bill, there's going to be revolution on the West Coast. But Hayes decided to pull the trigger. He disagreed with the bill. He was a very moral man, and he saw this for what it was, discrimination against the Chinese, while not making restrictions. It wasn't that he was against restrictions on immigration. He was against restrictions on immigrations that were exclusively aimed at one group over another. And so Rutherford B. Hayes will veto the Chinese exclusion bill, which will hurt him in any chance to run for presidency again. And then finally, in the lower center cartoon, you see Rutherford B. Hayes with a huge right shoe kicking a future president, Chester Arthur, out of his job as customs collector and chief of customs in New York City. One of the areas of intense corruption were tariffs and customs collections, and Hayes, in an effort to clean house, didn't play well even with his own party. And in reforming the Republican Party, he was forced to remove high-level Republicans from office, which then angered the stalwarts in his party. The Republicans are breaking into two wings, stalwarts and reformers. And the reformers are, the stalwarts are angry at Hayes' elimination of Chester Arthur from the customs collection and his moves against others. And so he's presented with a failure to work with the GOP leadership, GOP standing for the Republican Party, the grand old party, the party of the Republic, as opposed to the Democrats, who were the oldest party but had favored secession. And so Hayes chooses, at the end of his presidency, Hayes is mentally worn out and decides not to seek the nomination even if he could have gotten it, and decides to only be a one-term president. So in the election of 1880, the presidency is open, and the Republicans turn to what would be a dark horse candidate. Like Rutherford B. Hayes, Rutherford B. Hayes had been a colonel in the Union Army. James Garfield also served as a colonel and then, I believe, a general in the Union Army. So he was a distinguished war veteran. But he was a reformer, a moderate reformer, and he sought to strike a balance with the stalwarts. And you see that reflected in his choice as vice president. Look who it is, Chester Arthur. So James Garfield, a reformer, chooses Chester Arthur, a stalwart, as his running mate. But the Democrats have a move to check the waving of the bloody shirt of the Republicans. They've been beaten in so many elections that they decide to run a candidate that's above reproach. And they choose Winfield Scott Hancock. Any of you who have studied the Civil War recognize the name. General Winfield Scott Hancock, a Union general that had fought valiantly, was known for treating prisoners of war with courtesy and respect, for not sacrificing his men in needless charges. He was thrifty with both lives and ammunition and sought a quick conclusion to the war. And so Winfield Scott Hancock, as a Democratic candidate, a reformer, and the Democrats, while favoring reform, just like the Republicans with their prime candidate, his choice of William English as a vice presidential candidate was a tip of the hat to, although they weren't formally called the stalwarts, to the old guard of the Democratic Party. And so in 1880, it's going to be a race yet again of two reformers squaring off with a platform calling for lowered tariffs, tariff reform, civil service reform, and an elimination of corruption from government. And in the election of 1880, with both campaigns run quite well, they have very good candidates. There's no doubt about this election. President Garfield easily wins. And he appoints a fairly substantive cabinet. Now the question would be, could Garfield maintain this bag of cats that is an administration? Lincoln has been praised in a recent biography called A Team of Rivals. And President Obama recently appointed his rivals, Hillary Clinton being his chief rival, as his Secretary of State, in an attempt to silence the opposition by bringing them close. And Abraham Lincoln had successfully done that in prosecuting the war, and then as soon as Lincoln died, it fell apart for Andrew Johnson. That's exactly what President Garfield is doing with this cabinet. He appoints the stalwart Chester Arthur as vice president to bring that wing of the party in. And another stalwart and a force to be reckoned with from the Senate was James G. Blaine, a senator from Maine. And Blaine was one of the most powerful senators of his day. And so to bring him into the fold, Garfield offers him the plum office of Secretary of State. By the way, up until this day, it was the Secretary of State that was the heir apparent to the president, that when the president served 1 or 2 terms, it would be the Secretary of State who ran for president next, not the vice president. To echo the words of Texas Vice President John Nance Garner during the FDR administration, the vice presidency was the equivalent of a bucket of warm piss. And he did say piss. The media always cleans it up and says spit. But he said the vice presidency was like a bucket of warm piss. It's not worth anything. You're there just simply in case the president dies. And so James G. Blaine is the heir apparent. You also should recognize the name of the Secretary of War, Robert Todd Lincoln. Garfield bringing Robert Lincoln, it was known as Todd or Tad, bringing Tad Lincoln into the administration as Secretary of War, tying himself to Abraham Lincoln's legacy through Abraham Lincoln's son. And so a very strong cabinet. The problem for Garfield came on his entrance into office. He's a reformer. 100% of the federal government is based upon presidential appointment. If you're not an elected official, you are an appointed official. Everybody from the postmaster in Tyler, Texas, or whatever community had a post office, pick your poison, Kilgore, Texas, or Brownsboro, Texas, from that postmaster or postmistress all the way up to Secretary of State, those were all appointed officials, and it required a presidential appointment with congressional approval. And so presidents tended to reward their political favorites with spoils. Andrew Jackson had coined the term the spoils system. And so Garfield doesn't like it. He wants to change it, but there's nothing he can do about it yet. So his first months in office, he's besieged by office seekers. Some of them simply won't do, and he turns them away. Others get jobs. And so as Garfield is settling into his presidency, remember he comes into office first week in January at this point. Presidents were inaugurated in January. On July 2nd, 1881, President Garfield was walking with Chester Arthur to the Washington train station, and one of those disgruntled office seekers and an anarchist, Charles Julius Guiteau, walks up behind Garfield and shoots him in the back. You can see the revolver there. That's an actual picture of the revolver. You'll have to look at a picture because the actual revolver has disappeared from the Smithsonian. It's gone missing. But it's a British Bulldog revolver, and Guiteau shoots Garfield in the back. Point blank range. He had stalked Garfield for a month, had followed Garfield all over Washington. The Secret Service isn't anywhere near what it is today, just a couple of agents, and they stayed fairly good distance from the president. So Guiteau was able to follow Garfield. He, in fact, had tried to assassinate Garfield at an earlier point, but had observed that Mrs. Garfield was with President Garfield and that she was sick, and he didn't want to upset her. So he didn't shoot Garfield then. He waited till July 2nd, 1881, and he shoots Garfield in the back. Immediately, the Secret Service and the officials there in the railroad gather around Garfield. They carry him up to an upstairs office, and they begin trying to get the bullet out. There were a number of doctors in the train station. They rushed upstairs, open up the back, and you can see how many layers Garfield's wearing. He's wearing a jacket. He's wearing a waistcoat. He's wearing a shirt. He's probably wearing long johns under that. So he's got at least 4 layers of cloth. And they know they have to get the bullet out, and they have to get whatever cloth may have been carried into the wound out. So these doctors begin immediately working. They don't sterilize their hands. They start digging into Garfield's back, and they turn a bullet wound that's probably the diameter of my pinky. They turn a bullet wound of that size into an 18-inch gash, digging with their dirty hands into his back. Garfield doesn't die from the bullet wound. He dies from infection. He lingers from July 2nd through September 19th. So for 11 weeks, Garfield seems to recover, then he regresses, seems to recover, then he regresses, and on September 19th, President Garfield died. And the nation went into mourning for its dead president. I believe he's the 4th to die in office. And so James Garfield, you see his casket lying in state in the bottom right, and the White House in mourning with black bunting on it in the upper right. What was just as important as the assassination of Garfield was what Guiteau supposedly shouted as he shot Garfield. Now, reports vary, but it, in essence, was, "I'm a stalwart, Garfield's dead, Arthur's now president." And so Guiteau linked himself to Vice President Chester Arthur and Arthur's agenda. So as the Vice President ascends to the highest office, he has the memory of his dead boss on his mind, and it changes his political outlook, which we'll look at next time.